Okay, I think we will get started. Again, welcome to our new installment of the Conversation with the Dean, our webinar series focused on discussing recent events and important hot topics with scholars and leaders here at Boston University and Wheelock College. This series is deeply rooted in our ongoing efforts here at Wheelock. Each discussion will focus on the complexity of a particular issue and seek to uncover the transformational opportunities to see students, to support students and see communities and students and families thrive. So we've found these webinars to be a great source of information from our faculty colleagues and focused on their work, and illustrates how our faculty are focused on the GuideStar. So today's topic is particularly meaningful to me, focus on special education and teachers. While students in need of special education services currently make up about 15% of all public school enrollment, teachers with special education expertise are very much in short supply. Today, we'll explore why this is and what factors may be contributing to the shortage and some possible solutions. How is it that some of our most vulnerable students' needs are going unaddressed? And I'm honored to be joined by two BU Wheelock professors in our special education program to delve into this issue and to consider some of the particular details as well as ways we might be able to think about it and to address the challenge. So first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Bettini, who goes by Liz. Liz is an associate professor in the special education program at BU Wheelock. Liz's research examines factors shaping the special education teacher workforce and inequities in access to skilled, committed special education teachers based on students' disability, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. Liz previously taught students with emotional and behavioral disorders in self-contained and inclusive settings in Arizona and Connecticut. Liz, thanks for joining us. Excited to have our conversation with you. And then I'd like to also introduce Dr. Zachary Rossetti, who goes by Zach. Zach is also an associate professor of special education at BU Wheelock. Zach's research focuses on social inclusion and belonging of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. His research also examines family advocacy and engagement in the special education system, centering on participation and language access in their children's IEP meetings. Central to all of his research is the context of inclusive education for students with IDD. Zach is a former elementary school special education teacher and inclusion facilitator from New Hampshire. Liz and Zach, I'm proud to be your colleague and it's pleased that you agreed to have this conversation with me this afternoon. So we're going to jump right in. I do want to encourage the audience to, throughout the discussion, to feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box. And we will do our best to answer them either in writing in the Q&A, and I've invited Liz and Zach to participate in that as well. Or I will try to thread them into the conversation if they seem appropriate for the time. So again, welcome, and we're excited for the conversation today. So let me begin by just sort of level setting with you both about where we are with this teacher shortage. And are we in a crisis? Is this new? Like, what can you tell us about the teacher shortage? How dire is it? What's happening here in Massachusetts, but what's going on nationally? And how can these concerns around teacher shortages broadly are being felt specifically in our field of special education? Liz, maybe we'll start with you to give us a little sense of the national picture.
Yeah, I mean, I think a key point that often gets lost in the conversations around this is that this is not a new problem in special education. We've had special education teacher shortages for as long as special education has existed as a national public education mandate. So we first had special education as a public education mandate in 1975. That was nearly 50 years ago. And we have had special education teacher shortages throughout that time. It is a national problem. It's been characterized as severe, chronic, and pervasive. So just to give you an example of what that looks like, 22% of districts in the country report that they have vacant special education positions that they have not been able to fill or that they've had to fill with unqualified personnel. In some states, Texas reports on the order of 20% of special education teacher positions are either vacant or filled by unqualified personnel. So that's 1 out of every 5 students with a disability has a special education teacher who's not adequately qualified. In Hawaii, the numbers are about 15%, so that's about 1 in 6. We've got data from a variety of states. We unfortunately don't have good national data on this, but we have a very large proportion of students with disabilities who are being served by unqualified personnel. And it's not a new problem. That doesn't mean it isn't a crisis. It just means people are paying attention to it now, which I'm very grateful for, but it's always been a problem in special education.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Zach, maybe you can share a little bit about your experience as a special education teacher, and Liz, you're welcome to jump in on this too, but why special education? Why is there a pervasive shortage here? I am been around the block a few years, Liz. I know this has been a problem for many, many years. I'm just sort of curious about why it might be that why we have a shortage in this area. Zach, you want to give us a little bit of background and tell us about your experience and what you know about it?
Sure. I think on the supply side, I think there's still a fundamental piece of this that relates to how students with disabilities, people with disabilities, are viewed in the general public, which is not great. Still, often from a deficit perspective, people might have low expectations and therefore think, oh, I don't know if I can teach those students. They're hard to teach, or and I've heard Liz say this as well, that special ed teachers are not real professional skilled teachers. I've heard so many times throughout my life, like, oh, you must be so patient. You must be such a good person to be able to teach those kids. And I my my wife and daughter would tell me would say I'm very impatient about certain things. I just worked hard to learn the skills and knowledge to teach students that I really liked and wanted to connect with and knew weren't getting a good deal in schools. So that's a piece of it. And then I think the other piece, maybe reflecting the demand side of it, is that it is a very stressful job due to the conditions that you find yourself in as a special education teacher. I'll just list a couple and then pause, and I'm sure for Liz to jump in. But you special ed teachers tend to be really isolated, and again, it reflects how kids are treated and services for those kids are delivered. Classrooms are often in the basement or set aside in a school, refurbished closets. I shared a classroom with the 2 other special ed teachers in the school, and we all were trying to teach while we could hear the others. There's can be a disillusionment or frustration or anger for new teachers who recognize how they're treated, how their students are treated. If you enter wanting to be inclusive, how schools are not often inclusive. And then you have to do a ton of things as a special ed teacher and don't often have the time or resources to do them beyond just teaching and preparing your lessons.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I was just going to say, do you think Liz, I want you to jump in here because I know this is one of your areas of research, but I'm curious, Zach, do you think the work is any harder than a typical classroom teacher?
Are you trying to get me in trouble here?
No, I'm just curious. I'm really curious. I mean,
yeah,
go ahead.
In I do in settings that are not inclusive, special ed teachers, like I was one of my first jobs was hired as a resource teacher. So I had this shared room. I was supposed to teach 3rd and 4th graders with disabilities in this shared room. It was distracting to them, and I valued inclusion. So part of my job became like trying to, because the school didn't have structures or a vision of inclusion, trying to like get the classroom teachers to include my students, which, you know, led to a whole host of problems. Classroom teachers have 2 parent-teacher conferences a year, and, you know, best practice and out of necessity, um, communication with families of children with disabilities needs to be, for a variety of reasons, far more regular and consistent. Just as a couple of examples of additional things that, and when we're often called whenever a student, because we know how to support behaviors, whenever there's a behavioral challenge, who's called? The special ed teacher.
Right, right. Liz, jump in here.
Yeah, I would agree that it's harder. And I also think that Zach is making a really important point here that I want to make sure folks don't miss. It's not harder because of the kids, right? I think that's often a misconception that like, oh, it's harder because the kids are more difficult. That is not it. Most special education teachers, and there's very good research on this, most special education teachers, the best part of their day, the part they feel most rewarded by and satisfied with, is the part of their day that they're interacting with kids, that they're directly working with children. What makes it challenging is the way that the school isn't designed around the needs of those students. And so then as a special ed teacher, you're constantly having to fight against the structure of the workplace that you're in. So just as an example, you know, the school is set up with time budgeted for, you know, parent-teacher conferences twice a year for students who are not identified as having disabilities. And that is built into your contract as a teacher. That is built into your schedule, right? As special ed teachers, if we're doing our jobs well, we're communicating with families much more. That is not built into our schedules. That's not built into our union negotiated contracts. That's not built into the structure of how the school is set up in the same way that those parent-teacher conferences are set up and for students without disabilities. And so that means as a special educator, you're constantly having to either fight against the school structure that isn't designed for your students or work above and beyond the normal school day. I'll give another example. I worked in a district where, you know, we had, you know, a lot of things were pretty good. But all of our assessments were not accessible to students who were struggling to read, right? So we had a number of middle school students who were reading at a, you know, kindergarten through 3rd grade level, and they could not access their science assessments, their reading, their, you know, math assessments and so on. And so every day after school, the special ed teachers would record the assessment on an iPod. This is like 2006. So this was like, it was like, oh, they got us iPods, you know? But that was extra time that they were spending to put every single assessment. These are district-wide assessments. Why not, when you roll out the curriculum, make it universally designed so that it's accessible to everybody? And then that's not an extra burden on every single individual special educator who's having to record these assessments for their students, right? So when you have an environment that's designed assuming that these students don't exist or assuming that these students' needs are something extra, right? Then the person who's serving that student has to go above and beyond, has to push against that system to get those students' needs met. And so it's not harder because of the kids. It's harder because of the way the system is designed.
Say a little bit more about, I want to get to another topic, which is what are the wonderful things about being a special education teacher? But Liz, I know your research in particular focuses on teacher recruitment, teacher pipeline, teacher conditions. So Zach mentioned physical issues like teaching in basements or closets. I've been hearing those stories for 40 years, right? This is not, it kind of puts a fine point on the comment you made, Liz, that people don't consider students.
The building isn't set up.
Yeah, we don't design buildings. I mean, some of those buildings are gone and they've created new ones and they still didn't think about it.
And some are not ADA compliant. I mean, we've had teacher candidates who use wheelchairs who cannot get to their classroom because the elevator is broken or the elevator takes so long they can't go to take a bathroom break or get lunch. I mean, some of the buildings are not. Sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. Well, just take a couple of more minutes and say a few more things about your research in particular. And before you talk, I want to mention to the audience that in the chat, our friend and colleague Megan Combe is dropping in some resources that Zach and Liz may mention throughout their presentation that you can draw onto, which is their work and the work of others that they want to make sure you have access to, that we may not directly talk about or have a chance to discuss in detail on today's call. So Go ahead, Liz. More about the conditions that you think might contribute to the shortage or to the challenges.
Yeah, so there's when we talk about working, I always talk about it as working conditions. These are the conditions that teachers are experiencing in their work. And when we're talking about working conditions, we're usually talking about two things. So we're talking about, on one hand, what are the responsibilities that people have on their plates, the things they are responsible for doing throughout the day. That includes instruction, it includes caseload management, paperwork, communicating with families, and so on. And then you have the resources that folks have to fulfill those responsibilities. So resources includes things like, curriculum, classroom space, supportive colleagues, supportive administration, and so on. And what we find for special educators and for all teachers, actually, that we've looked at this with, is that when your demands and your resources are well balanced, you're able to manage those responsibilities well. You're able to serve students in ways that feel right, feel ethical. When those demands and resources are out of balance, so when you have demands that you go beyond what you have resources to meet, beyond the time that you have, beyond the materials that you have, and so on, you wind up having to do things like triage. All right. So today, I know I have a lesson for my students this afternoon, and I also know my paperwork is due, and I don't have time to do both. So I'm going to show my kids a movie. And I've talked with teachers who've made that choice and felt horrible about it, right? Like that's not an ethical thing to do. And also, it is the position that they were placed in by a set of working conditions that didn't give them time for all of their responsibilities. And that is very stressful. And that stress weighs on folks. And over time, it leads to burnout and to decisions to leave teaching. So what we find is when folks say that their demands are outweighing their resources, when they are feeling like their workload is not manageable and they're not able to serve kids effectively, that's when they're starting to look at going other places.
Interesting. Okay, now my follow-up question feels a little strange here, but I'm going to drop it in anyway and try to wind it around this. We all become teachers because we love working with children. We love to watch them grow and develop, and we get involved in special education because we see the importance of the work that's done by special educators. But talk a little bit about those joys. What did you love about teaching in this field? And we probably all have personal connections we could draw on. But Zach, do you want to share yours?
Sure. Thank you. I mean, I love that question and that we're taking time because it's often overlooked, as you both have said. I think the one thing that resonated with me, and I think most of us, is the progress that's made, especially when it took a while, when it was hard at first, when there were battles and you had to show that you weren't going anywhere and stay there, right? And I said earlier, I think I got into this because I found that my favorite students were the ones that a lot of other teachers complained about and didn't want in their class. And one little or third grade girl that stands out, didn't speak up a lot in class, acted out a lot in class. And, over the course of some weeks with me, I found out that she liked frogs. I had a little toy frog, and I started letting her play with the frog. And then she kind of counted, toes? I don't know if they have, the toes of the frog. And then we started skip counting. And as she skip counted, I remember she was clapping and moving her body a lot. We had a trampoline. And so then our system became, she would skip count while jumping on the trampoline, like obviously had either, some physical or rhythmic piece that helped her. And during the course of this year, through things like, growing from that entry point, we got her back in class. And I think that sometimes, it may seem unconventional, grounded by what we know about evidence-based practices and how to be a good teacher, and growing from these entry points of trust and relationship building.
100. I just
Yeah, jump in.
The most satisfying part is definitely the kids. It's definitely the relationships you form with the kids and when you see them making personal growth. I was, Zach, I was thinking about a little girl who we taught who, for a variety of reasons, just like trusted no one, and she was bolting from school every day. And like the process of getting her to trust that she was safe at school, that she was safe to relax and learn, and then like watching her eventually be able to be really successful and to show us all the things that she knew that we didn't know she knew. It's just an incredibly satisfying. Working with the kids is the best. And when you're in a place where you're able to meet all of the kids' needs, it's a very satisfying.
I should add quickly too, as someone who spent a lot of my career trying to promote inclusion, there were 100% the progress with the kids is the best part. But
Yeah,
there were moments of success with teachers where, I got them to, and this is so ridiculous and part of the stress of the job, like to allow a student with a disability in their room. And then it's like, okay, what can I do to show them how to teach this child? And I hope nothing goes bad because this might be our only shot. And when they pick up like, oh, if I do this ahead of time, she's less likely to act out or have some kind of disruption. Or if we give her the materials in this format or give her a word bank or whatever it is, like she's going to participate. And so many moments where teachers realized how to better support kids and were open to it. Some still weren't, which relates to that negative view of disability and ableism that's still so prevalent, but those were good moments too.
Thank you for sharing both of those, and I'm thinking of some of my own experiences in that light. I want to wrap a couple of questions in the chat or in the Q&A are about this relationship between general education and special education. How do we keep from siloing ourselves? And I vividly recall we've often prepared special education teachers to also know how to collaborate. I don't know that we do that with general education teachers, but the onus was on the special educator to figure out how to collaborate with the general educator for the reasons you're describing, Zach, right? Like to look for that way to help the general education teacher accommodate the student in their classroom that we know is vulnerable, but we also knew how to help them. So all of that to say, I'm really curious if you can talk a little bit about the specialized knowledge that special educators need, and then how that might play into this shortage issue. I mean, is it such that it makes it harder to prepare a special educator? Is it does the type of work we do make it less desirable as a professional? And just for those in the audience who aren't familiar with this topic, this is the purpose of special education, is really specialized instruction to meet the needs of the students we're talking about. So do I have a clear question there? I don't
yeah,
I think there were four
this
clear
at
questions
you,
in
so
there.
go ahead.
Go ahead,
Right.
Zach.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Liz, feel free to jump in as well. I think it is a lot. And we often talk as faculty members, we have a number of credits and courses that we require, and still it doesn't feel like enough, because it is a lot. You're learning multiple ways to teach academic content, to provide accommodations, to provide academic, behavioral, social, emotional supports. And one thing that I really want to say too, and I know you and others on the call probably know this, but the word disability refers to so many different things. And every child with one of those different diagnoses experiences it differently. So we're teaching skills and knowledge in the ballpark, but you still, all teachers do this, get to know your kids and develop relationships. But I think it's much more necessary and relates more to outcomes possibly in special education.
Yeah,
I
was
would,
there
yeah,
anything
I
to
would say,
follow up on?
yeah, I would say that this is part of a broader and systemic issue that goes far beyond teacher prep and far beyond K-12, which is that there are so many areas of knowledge and skill that folks need to be an effective teacher. It is incredibly complex work, and it requires sophisticated pedagogical content knowledge in multiple areas, knowledge of kids, knowledge of how schools operate. It's not a simple job, and preparing someone to do that really well is a substantial investment. It's a substantial investment of, if we really wanted to prepare them in the ideal possible way, right? It would be a substantial investment of their time, of our time as teacher educators, and of time in schools where they would be doing, field work and practicum experiences. And we are very, very crunched for time to provide the kinds of experiences that they need. In many professions, my brother-in-law is a state trooper. He was paid his full salary while he went through training.
Mm-hmm.
From the day he started training, he was making his full salary. Pre-service teachers are not paid. And in fact, while they're going through their field experiences, which is one of the most important parts of their teacher preparation, they have to work full-time in a school, typically unpaid.
Yeah. That
is a systemic problem. That keeps people who would like to join the profession out, who can't afford to do 6 months without working a full-time job. And that is a larger policy and systems issue that I think needs to be addressed at a bigger issue, at a bigger level.
Zach, were you going to say something?
No.
Okay.
No.
I was just going to say, not only do they not get paid, they're usually paying tuition to a university or some kind of another agency, which actually comes to a question that one of the audience members asked. Is there evidence that shows that a certain kind of preparation, and by the way, I have not paid any actors to either write the question or, and Liz and Zach are answering honestly. So is there evidence that any type of preparation, either traditional or alternative, is better than another in terms of let's say, effectiveness of the special educator or duration in the classroom? You know the kind of metrics we might be looking at.
Yeah. So there's regarding effectiveness, there is not particularly solid evidence. And there's a lot of complexities to that kind of research. In particular, the folks who choose to enroll in alternative preparation programs are systematically different from the folks who enroll in traditional preparation programs. And so any kind of conclusions you want to draw about differences in their effectiveness, you can't kind of control for the unmeasured differences in who chooses to take those pathways, right? So it is very hard to say, are alt prep programs, less effective or more effective than traditional prep in terms of the effectiveness of the candidates. Though descriptively, there's some really clear evidence that folks who go through an alternative preparation program or any kind of faster program tend to stay in the field for a shorter duration of time. So they tend to turn over more rapidly than folks who go through traditional preparation programs. They are also much more likely to be people of color, and that's tremendously important. We have a predominantly white teacher workforce serving a student population that is increasingly racially and ethnically diverse. And alt prep programs have made access to the profession so much more accessible for folks who can't take, 6 months off to do student teaching. Yeah. And so the folks who are graduating through alternative preparation programs do tend to be much more racially and ethnically diverse, and that's a key component of what they're offering to schools.
Yeah, one of our audience members, Dana, has asked a question about policy implications on contracts and employment agreements, particularly for LEAs, local education agencies. I'm curious whether either of you have thoughts about. I think that's you've made a nuanced point here, Liz, right? So we are working hard to try to recruit a more diverse teaching workforce that looks like the students they serve. We know that many times they're coming through different kinds of preparation programs that are more accessible to them financially. Are there things we might be doing at the front end of their time in the classroom, as that would be policy at a district level, that would likely keep them there longer? Like your brother-in-law, a trainee.
I think that there's very good evidence that first of all, being dropped right into a classroom without preparation is a really hard experience for someone. I taught in an emergency license my first year, and it was a horrible experience. And the fact that I stuck with it is a miracle. But I think that folks are better served when we provide them with scaffolded opportunities to learn how to teach. So when they have a student teaching experience, when they have opportunities for mentorship before they take over the classroom, I don't think it's a good idea to drop someone in who hasn't had those things. And I think we could make that more accessible to them by paying them. There is very good evidence that student teachers benefit the schools that they're in. There's actually evidence from the Calder Center that their mentor teachers become more effective. The more times that you mentor a pre-service teacher, you become more effective. There's also real advantages for the districts they work in. So if you are a district and you're looking to recruit more teachers, take in pre-service teachers as student teachers in your district and pay them, and they are more likely to work in your school district subsequently. A large portion of pre-service teachers stay in their placement district when they finish, and they are more effective when they do so. So that's a great strategy for folks who are looking to recruit someone. So I think that's something we could do to kind of ease their entry in. For folks who are just kind of dropped in without those prior experiences, as I was, research strongly supports the importance of mentorship, of making sure they have a mentoring and induction program that helps them to figure out what they're doing, that maybe relieves a little bit of the demands on them, so that they can focus on serving their students.
That addresses part of that, isolation that a lot of teachers experience as well. Like in a lot of schools, all the second grade teachers, all the science teachers in high school or what, like they have structured planning time, but also tend to kind of hang out and work through problems together. And there are usually only a few special ed teachers spread apart, or you're so busy, even though like I shared the room. I did have a great mentor, but we were all so busy that there wasn't as much of that social interaction and shared problem solving as well. I think related to the teacher prep question, I think there's also a piece related to inclusive ed. And, we see silos in schools, K through 12, pre-K through 12 schools, and there are also silos that we're trying to cross in higher ed as well, right? And, in this day and age, any teacher is going to have students with disabilities in their classroom. When I talk about more inclusive ed, it's usually for students with extensive support needs, who are students with intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, autism, oftentimes. And so the more that we can prepare all teachers, to teach all students to know what to do, to support behaviors and things like that, they'll feel more successful and more likely to stay. They'll have more successful time with students. And it also addresses, troubling patterns that we see where students with extensive support needs, students of color, English learners with disabilities are very clearly and have been among the least included in the most separate classrooms as well. So it can kind of meet multiple needs there as well.
So some of the challenges that we experience would be solved with more money.
Yeah, some of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. Public education in the United States, this is just a truism, right? We know that we know a lot about preparation of teachers. We know a lot about how people learn, particularly how adults learn. And for the most part, we ignore that when we're putting people in classrooms without a lot of experience to deal with very complex situations, and also put the onus on special education teachers, as I mentioned earlier, to be the collaborators, to figure out how to get students included in the classrooms and helping general ed teachers improve their inclusive practices, paperwork, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of things we could say about that. Budget definitely plays a role here. And for 40 years, we've been really trying to, I would say the federal government in particular has always been trying to incentivize more teachers in the classrooms for special education, et cetera. There's a fascinating question in the Q&A I want to ask the two of you to respond to. Somebody on this call is old enough to remember when schools did not include students with special needs. I won't mention who, but my question, this is the question, and I think it comes from one of our students actually. What would it take for there to be a big breakthrough in special education or in the way in inclusive education, like major breakthrough? Would it mean getting rid of something we're currently doing? Would it mean billions of dollars? What might that be? Think big here. It's a great question. I love it. Breakthrough. She said breakthrough, which I think is kind of cool. Cool question.
That's an amazing question. The first thing that's coming to mind, and I'm sure there's others, so Liz, is the federal law. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was last reauthorized, updated, as these federal laws are, in 2004. It's long overdue. And if there were clear and specific language and guidance around inclusion. Inclusion is like the word inclusion is not in the law. The closest principle or mandate is around least restrictive environment, which says students with disabilities to the maximum extent possible are educated with students without disabilities. And that allows different interpretations, and for some students, to not be included in the general ed classroom. And so for me, I think if that were clarified and shifted so that the starting point for all students was the general ed classroom. And the focus was all teachers, including special ed teachers, collaborating, sharing resources. If we don't get that $1 billion influx, sharing resources to teach kids there would be a fundamental shift for me, I think.
Yeah, Liz?
I would say, I think leaders have a huge role to play here. School leaders and district leaders, principals, superintendents, special education directors. They're the ones who set the tone for the school. They're the ones who have potential to create systems and structures that are inclusive of all students, to order curriculum that are universally designed, to create schedules that incorporate, special educators' work within them in thoughtful ways. And one of the huge challenges underlying this is that often principals do not get access to even basic understandings of disability. In most leadership preparation, the only course that they take that relates to disability whatsoever, they learn about, here are the legal requirements so that you don't get sued. And from that lens, students with disabilities are positioned as a liability. As opposed to an asset, a value to the school, a member of the community. A disability is positioned as a liability as opposed to an identity or a community. And that is a huge problem. So I think that there could be much more intentional, deliberate, and systematic preparation for school and district leaders on what is disability, what is effective special education practice, what does inclusion mean, and how do we create school contexts that are inclusive of everybody.
Yeah, it's excellent.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Zach.
No, just quickly, I was going to say that plays out a bit in some of my work with families where they, overwhelmingly, families feel that IEP, the individualized education program meetings that they have annually with schools, are adversarial. And they don't feel collaborative. And they feel families feel they have to advocate above and beyond or monitor to make sure certain things are happening. And they say things in our most recent project, there's a pattern where families are saying, it's not the teacher. I know the teachers are trying. They tell me things outside of the meeting, or they're advocating. It's the lack of resources, and sometimes the school leaders who are focusing on what to do to not get sued instead of what's best for this child. Yeah, and it plays out in different ways. And that's a huge one.
There's a question in the Q&A I'm afraid we're not going to get to, but I want to acknowledge it and let the question asker, Valerie, know that I want to get back to your question via email. And it's about misdiagnosis or mislabeling of multilingual learners as having a disability. This has been happening for a long time. Inadequate testing systems and mislabeling, and then struggling to have labels removed or supports appropriately put in place for the language differences rather than a disability. We have people who focus their attention in this area, and I will get back to you, Valerie, on that. Zach, you mentioned a project. I want to ask each of you to talk about a project you're working on currently that you're excited about, just so the audience knows a little bit more about what you're doing. And if it relates to this topic of teacher shortage, even better. Liz, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, we have a grant that we just started this year. It's called Project Respect. My co-PI on it, I think, is in the room. Nelson Brunstein. He's one of the participants with us today. So we, yeah, we are developing and validating a measure of special education teachers' working conditions. And the idea is that this will be a measure that district leaders can administer to all of the special education teachers in their district to help them, or states could potentially administer to identify, what are the working conditions that are problematic in our district and how could we improve them. So, for example, they might find we're really overloading folks with paperwork, or they don't have enough planning time, and they could make systemic changes in response to that. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome. Thank you.
That's amazing.
Zach?
Yeah, the project I mentioned is a project focused on advocacy broadly. It's with families and transition-aged youth with disabilities, so 14 and older, and specifically legislative advocacy. And that project has included a training, focus groups, and preparation with families to advocate for changes in the federal law related to their experiences and what they know about teacher experiences. And it's been fun to work on. And again, lots of families are challenged in this area, but I very clearly not blaming teachers.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing both of those. There's a question in the Q&A from Nancy who asked about whether there are fields like early education and care that would potentially be sources of special education teachers. I think the answer is a resounding yes. I also want to mention I had a pleasure to visit Mesa schools in Arizona recently, and I found this really important thing. A pod of teachers across multiple disciplines, and this was a high school, and you all know high school special ed historically can be very challenging and isolating for teachers. The special ed teacher was working across these multiple disciplines and project-based learning groups, and the disciplinary teachers, the math teacher, the social studies teacher, the English teacher, they said to me, each of them, she brought us learning tools that we didn't know existed. And we've given them to all of our students, and the students said, wow, how come you've never used these before? Right? So there are things about specialized knowledge of a special education teacher that can be enormously beneficial for other teachers who just don't have that experience or training. So yes, Nancy, early education care is a good place to as a resource for future special education teachers. Last question, and then we'll stop. And I know I'm going to get the boot here, but I do want to ask this question before we go there. We are at BU Wheelock seeing a slight positive upward trend in enrollment in our graduate programs. And I'm curious why you think that might be, Zach and Liz. What's special about our program that you're both involved with, that I'm a part of, that you think might be attracting teachers? And yeah, we're past time, so just quickly.
I feel like I think we have done a pretty good job in recent years of building partnerships with local schools and districts. And I think that's been a huge asset to our capacity to prepare folks well. I think that's probably a big piece of it.
Yeah. Zach, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a really strong um, program and kind of group of students leaving with their severe disability certification under the guidance of Donna Lair and Nancy Hariyama.
Yeah.
So that's a piece, and I think we as a program, we have, I think, all of the important bases covered: leading researchers and centers and literacy instruction and mental health, but we all focus kind of systemically also in terms of both teacher prep and practice, and so I think we translate research into practice well. We all taught, and I think we do a strong job in that area.
I want to thank you both. I know how busy you both are. I should just say to the audience, Liz and Zach both serve as editors of major journals. Liz for the teaching exception,
Teacher education and
teacher
special
education and special
starting in
education.
January, not yet, but soon.
Yeah, soon, yeah. And Zach is the editor of our own Journal of Education at BU. Well, a couple of things, if you're interested in being involved, there's a couple of centers at Wheelock that have deep interest in the topics of preparation of special education teachers. The Wheelock Institute for the Science of Education, WISE, and the Wheelock Education Policy Center. Also, if you're interested in possibly becoming a special education teacher, we'd love for you to reach out to our program director, Lindsay Chapman, who is available and would love to talk about that. And if you are enjoying the webinar series, we'd love to have you join us on April 4th. We'll talk about traditional teacher preparation and how that is changing with two of our fabulous colleagues, Megan Combe and Eleonora Villegas-Reimers. Megan from the Wheelock Education Policy Center, and Eleonora, who chairs our Department of Teaching and Learning. Thank you all for being here. And again, Liz and Zach, thanks for joining.